In today's video, I want to talk to you guys about fishing the bladed jig or the chatterbait. And I want to talk to you guys about some tips that I've learned about fishing the bladed jig that help me go from having minimal confidence in the bait to having a tremendous amount of confidence in the bait, and it being a bait that I've got tied on 365 days a year. And I have just as much confidence to fish it in 40-degree water as I do in 80-degree water. And you know, the reason I wanted to make this video is because I've done some bladed jig or chatterbait fishing videos in the past, and so many people are like, I have zero confidence, I have zero confidence, I have zero confidence. And so what I want to do is give you some tips to hopefully help build your confidence so that you feel like I do about the bait and realize just how versatile that it actually is. So tip number one is going to be realizing that the bladed jig is not just a grass fishing bait. So many anglers have done really well fishing around grass. I mean, there was a stretch there on like the professional circuit where dudes were fishing the bladed jig on grass lakes and winning almost every single tournament on a bladed jig. And it is a phenomenal grass fishing lure, and I love to fish it around grass. But for me, I found the bladed jig to be even more effective around hard bottom areas. I throw a bladed jig around rock more than I throw it around grass most of the time. And I myself have won quite a bit of money and won quite a few tournaments and placed very high in tournaments where the day has been saved by a bladed jig fishing it around hard bottom. And so if you live in a place that doesn't have a bunch of grass, don't think that you just need to rule out the bladed jig. The bladed jig can be just as effective on hard bottom and around rock and around boat docks and around man-made things like riprap walls and stuff as it is in the grass. And sometimes I think it's even more effective. I remember watching, I believe it was the Tactical Bassin guys many years ago, and I don't know if it was Matt or Tim, but he mentioned something about like a whopper plopper or a choppo or a plopping style bait that they think around hard cover that it just amplifies that sound. Well, I think the same thing happens with a bladed jig. I think around hard cover, when that thing's knocking like it is, it just amplifies that sound and it kind of bounces off of that hard cover and it makes those fish want to eat it even more. And so keep that in mind, that it isn't just a grass bait. The next one is going to be, I normally throw the bladed jig when I am around a ton of bait. Whether that's a ton of bluegills or a ton of bait fish, I want something to stand out in the mass of all of that bait. And it's not that I've not had success, you know, fishing it for like individual fish or on individual pieces of cover. I have had a ton of success doing that, but there was one factor that kind of played into that we'll talk about here in just a second. But when I'm around a ton of bait fish is normally when I'm going to pick up the bladed jig or a chatterbait. There's something about the action of a bladed jig, just that loud knocking, that blade knocking back and forth, that trailer, the skirt, and all those things that helps it to do a really good job of standing out among a ton of real bait fish. And a lot of times what I've seen is that, like, I'll literally be reeling this thing through schools of bait and the schools of bait will be splitting apart and then a bass will come up and smoke it. I love fishing a bladed jig around certain kinds of shad spawns. I've talked about that on this channel. So anytime that I've got like a massive amount of bait up shallow, or I know there's a ton of bait up shallow, throwing something like a bladed jig helps me to stand out in that mass of bait. And so if you're dealing with a situation like right now in the spring where you've got shad spawns going on, we get late in the fall, you get those massive, you know, schools of shad that move up in there, throw the bladed jig around those areas. Don't throw, you know, you can still throw spinnerbait and things like that, but throw the bladed jig and see if you don't get some fish to react to it where you can't get them to react to things like a crankbait or a spinnerbait. There's something about the action of this bait that makes them want to eat. And then the last one is going to be fishing it around and in cover. That is where I've found the most success with the bladed jig. And the thing is I think there's so many people who overlook the bladed jig as a current fishing bait, but for me it is like the #1 current fishing bait that I've caught the most fish on in current, next to maybe even like a crankbait. It may have even caught more than a crankbait for me at this point. And a lot of it just has to do with having the right trailer on the back of that jig. And I actually did a video about this, and I'll make sure and link down below and in the pinned comments so that you guys can check it out. But fishing that bladed jig in current has been huge. And for me, fishing in current is king. Now, I know a lot of you guys are saying, well, Alex, I don't fish rivers, I don't fish creeks, I don't fish dam discharges, but current can be created by the wind by choke points and things like that. So if you're like fishing a pond and there's a culvert, there can be current coming out of that culvert. If you're fishing a lake and there's a bridge that funnels water down, that can create current. Fish the bladed jig in those areas, in those pinch points, in those kind of, you know, choke points. And I can promise you there's probably going to be a fish in there that wants to eat it. And if you want to watch my video where I talk about different bladed jig trailers and the ones that I actually like to use in current versus not, click this video. It's popping up right here.